Okay, so this is a quiz on Act 3. It is an open book quiz, so you should have your books out with you. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to start not with a question. I just want to go over something real quick. There's a little irony in what Benita says on page 133. She's talking to Asagai, and she says, I wanted to cure. It used to be so important to me. I wanted to cure. It used to matter. I used to care. I mean, about people and how their bodies hurt. And then Asuka says, okay, so you don't anymore? And he says, why? And she says, because it doesn't seem deep enough, close enough to what ails mankind. And it's interesting because Benita is completely right in a Christian sense. We know as Christians that what ails humanity, the deepest thing that is hurting humanity is sin. And the only remedy for that is the redemption through the cross. And so Benita's actually quite right. And the irony is, if you remember back in Act 1, Benita's the one who is talking about how I don't understand why God gets all the credit for the good things that humans do. And so Benita, the one who doesn't really even believe in God, has the most close has the theology that most closely resembles a Christian, right? That you're right, there's something that exists in this world that is too deep for any human to cure, that only God, only Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross could take care of what ails mankind, of what is hurting us. That God is the healer. And so it's interesting that, again, Benita, who doesn't necessarily even believe in God, has the most Christian theology there. All right, so your first question for pages 131 to 135, what does Asagai plan to do? What does he believe that he can achieve? And what is his purpose and goal is similar to which character from other books we've read, from another book that we have read? Okay, so what does Asagai plan to do? Well, he plans to actually return back to Africa, back to Nigeria, where he's from. And what does he believe he can achieve? He wants to change the community for the better. Little by little, he wants to impact his community and affect change. Does this sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what the House on Mango Street is about. This is just like Esperanza and her purpose, to return and inspire change within their own community. So it's really kind of beautiful. The Back to Africa movement, just so you know, Asagai talks to Benita and says, hey, you should come back with me, right? On page 137, 300 years later, the African prince rose up out of the seas and swept the maiden back across the middle passage over which her ancestors had come. This idea of going and returning back to Africa after having been a slave in America was a very real line of thinking related to the Black Power movement. And you're going to learn a little bit more about that as we read March Book 2. But this is a real idea that this is something that a lot of Black people in America were considering and thinking about. Like, maybe it is better that I actually return back to my roots, but I return back to Africa. A guy who is very well known for promoting this notion is Malcolm X. And if you haven't heard of him, that's okay, you will, because we're going to learn more about him in a little while. So, your next question answer, pages 136 to 142. Who or what do you think Willie Harris represents in the Black community? Okay, so who or what do you think Willie Harris represents in the Black community? Well, I think he is those that are from within the Black community but don't actually support the Black community, those who tear others down for their own sake. They are traitors. They are betrayers in a sense, okay? So we know that because he literally betrays Walter. He takes off with Walter's money, right? And leaves Walter and the rest of his family, those that were kind of working for progress within the Black community, he leaves them hanging out to dry. And so he is for sure a traitor. So another question for pages 142 to 143. What do you think Walter means when he says, I'm going to put on the show, Mama? Okay, what do you think Walter means when he says, I'm going to put on the show, Mama? All right, so I'm going to read you guys a little excerpt from something I found online because it'll explain it really well. But this has to do with Jim Crow. And you've probably heard of Jim Crow laws, right? Those are the segregation laws. But Jim Crow existed before those segregation laws anyway. It was a way to justify them. So I want to read this because they say it a lot better than I do. It says, throughout the 1830s and 1840s, there was a white entertainer named Thomas Dartmouth Rice who performed a popular song and dance act supposedly modeled after a slave. He named the character Jim Crow. Rice darkened his face, acted like a buffoon, and spoke with an exaggerated and distorted imitation of African American vernacular English. So this is a blackface performance. In his Jim Crow persona, he also sang Negro ditties such as Jump Jim Crow. After the American Civil War, most Southern states and later broader states passed laws that denied blacks basic human rights. It is not clear how, but the minstrel character's name Jim Crow became a kind of shorthand for the laws, customs, and etiquette that segregated and demeaned African Americans primarily from the 1870s to the 1960s. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with putting on the show? Well, first of all, Jim Crow was initially started as a show. It was a show of how dumb black people were. It was a show of how they should be in a subservient role. It was a show of how things should be segregated because black people are less than. Obviously, that's all ridiculous. I'm just saying that's what Jim Crow was all about. So to put on the show is to act exactly as racist whites would expect black people to act. Okay, to be subservient and grateful to even be a part of the conversation. So when Walter says, I'm going to put on the show, he is going to act exactly how racist white people would expect him to act. So Mr. Lindner would expect, yes, I will take the money and I will be grateful for it. And so that's what he means by putting on the show. It's incredibly demeaning, and it's for sure a loss of dignity there. Okay, another question, pages 143 to 151. Whose presence makes it harder for Walter to accept Lindner's money and easier for him to restore his pride? Okay, whose presence makes it harder for Walter to accept Lindner's money and easier for him to restore his pride, and why? Well, we know it's Travis. Earlier in the play, Walter chastises Ruth for telling Travis that they don't have any money to give him. Walter clearly wants to show Travis that they are a strong, proud family. So to give in to Mr. Lindner's offer would demonstrate a loss of pride, something that Walter is unable to do in front of his son, or unwilling to do in front of his son. Okay, last question. Would you describe the ending as happy? And that is the end of Act 3. That's the end of the play.